Her name was Jasmine Cole. Long before anyone in Seoul knew her name, she was already a woman who could command an entire room without ever raising her voice. In Atlanta, the mornings belonged to her. She stepped out of her apartment as golden sunlight spilled across the skyline, and people looked. Not because she demanded attention, but because there was something about her that simply refused to be ignored. Her deep auburn hair moved gently with the breeze. Her caramel skin caught the morning light. And behind those calm, almond-shaped eyes lived a mind far sharper than most people ever imagined. People saw beauty first. They always did. What they failed to see was the woman who had built an empire with her own hands. Cole Digital Security wasn't inherited. It wasn't handed to her, and it certainly wasn't luck. It was built in sleepless nights, in empty offices long after midnight, in years of sacrifice that no one ever witnessed. Every time someone said she couldn't, she answered with success, again and again, until the world stopped questioning her and started calling her. That morning, everything seemed ordinary. Fresh coffee, warm sunlight, the quiet comfort of a life she had earned. Then, her phone rang. An unfamiliar international number appeared on the screen. Something inside her, the same instinct that had protected her company countless times, told her to answer. "Miss Cole?" Her voice remained calm. "Speaking." "My name is Daniel Park, calling from Han Group in South Korea." She raised an eyebrow. Han Group, a name respected and feared, one of Asia's most powerful corporations. "I'm listening." "Our vice chairman has personally requested your expertise." Silence. Not hesitation, satisfaction. For years, people underestimated her before they ever heard her speak. Now, one of the most powerful men in Asia was asking for her by name. "I'll be there." 3 simple words, nothing more. The call ended, and with it, so did the quiet life she thought she knew. Seoul was different, a city built on ambition, glass towers reaching toward the sky, luxury cars moving through streets glowing beneath endless neon lights. At the center of it all, Han Group, a towering monument to wealth, power, and influence. When Jasmine stepped into the lobby, the whispers began immediately. "That's Jasmine Cole? I thought she'd be older." "I didn't expect her to be that beautiful. I heard she's a genius." She had heard it all before. Surprise, doubt, disbelief that beauty and brilliance could exist inside the same woman. She never reacted, never slowed her pace. Her heels echoed softly across polished marble as she walked with quiet confidence. Then, the elevator doors opened. The atmosphere changed instantly. Employees straightened without thinking. Respect, mixed with fear. A tall Korean man stepped out, perfectly tailored black suit, sharp jawline, cold eyes that revealed almost nothing. Soft dark hair framed a face that looked almost too perfect to be real. Beneath the sleeve of his expensive suit, a dragon tattoo curled along his arm, a quiet reminder that something dangerous lived beneath all that control. His name was Kang Min-jae, 34 years old, vice chairman of Han Group, one of the youngest billionaires in Asia, a man who had rarely heard the word no. He stopped walking. The moment he saw her, neither of them spoke. The lobby seemed to fall completely silent. Neither looked away. For several long seconds, 2 strangers measured each other, neither willing to surrender the moment. Then, without a word, he walked past her. Jasmine didn't turn around. She hadn't come to Seoul to impress anyone. She came to do her job. But something about that silent encounter stayed with her, like distant thunder, warning of a storm still beyond the horizon. She didn't know it yet. The man she had just met would one day humiliate her in front of 300 of the wealthiest people in Asia. Months later, his own life would rest entirely in her hands, and somewhere inside an abandoned warehouse, broken, chained, and barely alive, he would whisper her name like a prayer. But tonight, she knew none of that. She simply walked into her office, sat quietly beside the window, and watched the lights of Seoul shimmer across the city. Somewhere beyond those lights, a storm had already begun, and neither of them had any idea how much it would cost. If this story is pulling you in, then stay with me, because what happens next changes everything. Hit the subscribe button and comment where you're watching from. Sit back, relax, and enjoy this beautiful story. There's a particular kind of silence, the kind that only exists in rooms filled with powerful people. The silence, right before someone decides whether to respect you or dismiss you. Jasmine knew that silence well. She had learned to recognize it years earlier, in boardrooms across Atlanta, rooms where she was often the only woman, the only black executive, the only person who had built everything she owned from absolutely nothing. She recognized that silence again. The moment she walked into her first executive meeting at Han Group, a long, polished table, cold expressions, measured eyes, and at the head of it all, Kang Min-jae, dressed in an immaculate black suit, calm, controlled, unreadable. He didn't want her there. He never said the words. Men like him rarely needed to. Instead, he questioned everything. Every proposal she presented, every security recommendation she made, every warning she gave. No matter how carefully she explained it, he challenged it, as though her experience, her success, her reputation meant nothing, as though instinct was somehow greater than evidence. And every time she proved herself right, he found a quiet way to make it seem ordinary, as if admitting her brilliance would cost him something. But Jasmine had never been afraid of being underestimated. If anything, it made her stronger. Every late night inside Han Group, she uncovered another weakness, hidden vulnerabilities, invisible cracks, security flaws buried so deeply. Even the company's own engineers had missed them, one by one. She sealed them. She stopped cyber attacks before they ever reached the company's servers. She protected billions quietly, without asking for recognition, without demanding applause. Slowly, something changed. The board began trusting her. Employees who once whispered behind her back now spoke her name with respect. Even rival companies started asking who Jasmine Cole really was. She had quietly become one of the most valuable minds Han Group had ever seen. Only one person still refused to admit it. Kang Min-jae, one afternoon, after another meeting where he challenged her findings, without offering a single better solution. Jasmine stopped walking. She turned, looked directly into his eyes, and asked the question she had carried for weeks. Do you disagree because my ideas are wrong, or because they're mine? Silence. Real silence. For the first time, something shifted behind his eyes. Not anger, not surprise. Something smaller, a crack, in armor that had never been tested. Finally, he answered, I don't mix emotions with business. His voice never changed, flat, controlled, predictable. Jasmine smiled, not because it was funny, because she'd heard those words before. Different countries, different faces, the same excuse. Control, disguised as professionalism, distance, disguised as discipline. She held his gaze. Neither do I. Nothing more. Then she walked away. She never looked back. For the first time, he watched her leave, really watched. The confidence in every step, the quiet certainty, the complete absence of any need for his approval. It unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. His entire life, people had chased him, praised him, obeyed him. But Jasmine did none of those things. She simply didn't care. That night, long after the building had emptied, he remained alone in his office. Her report lay open across his desk. The numbers no longer held his attention. His dragon tattoos caught the soft glow of the desk lamp. As he slowly turned another page, he told himself he was reviewing her work. He wasn't. He was remembering the way she'd looked at him, steady, fearless, completely unimpressed by everything money had built around him. Someone else noticed, before he did, his grandmother. She had lived long enough to recognize silence, to recognize longing, before it had a name. She noticed the brief pause. Whenever Jasmine's name came up, she noticed his eyes lingering, just a little too long, on security camera footage during Jasmine's late-night work sessions. She said nothing. Not yet. She simply watched, patiently, the way grandmothers often do, when they know a story has already begun, long before anyone inside it realizes. Meanwhile, Jasmine kept working, kept proving herself, kept standing her ground inside a world that quietly questioned whether she belonged. She had no idea that Kang Min-jae's coldness was never really about her work. She didn't know that somewhere beneath the flawless suit, behind the carefully controlled expression, something inside him had already begun to change, slowly, reluctantly, in a direction he wasn't ready to admit. All Jasmine knew was that the tension between them was far from over, and somewhere deep inside, a quiet instinct whispered that everything happening inside those glass walls was only the beginning, because only weeks from now, under crystal chandeliers, surrounded by the wealthiest people in Asia, Everything between them was about to shatter completely in front of everyone. Some nights change everything. The people inside that ballroom didn't know it yet, but this was one of those nights. The Han Group Charity Gala was the most extravagant event of the year. Crystal chandeliers hung above the ballroom like frozen waterfalls. The marble floor reflected every light, every movement, every carefully crafted smile. Asia's wealthiest investors filled the room. Politicians, celebrities, executives whose words could move markets. With a single sentence, it was a room built on image, on status, on power, a place where everyone silently understood their position. Then Jasmine walked in. She wore an emerald gown that caught the chandelier light. With every step, her deep auburn hair rested in soft waves around her shoulders. She wore almost no jewelry. She didn't need it. Confidence was the only thing she carried, and it outshined every diamond. In that room, conversations faded, eyes followed her, not because she demanded attention, because she naturally owned it. Across the ballroom, Kang Min-jae looked up. For only a moment, his eyes found hers. Something flickered behind his carefully guarded expression. Then, he looked away. Beside him, his grandmother noticed. She always noticed. "She's remarkable." Her voice was quiet, steady. Min-jae never looked away from the crowd. "She's an employee." His words were cold, deliberate. His grandmother smiled, not with amusement, with certainty. "No." A brief pause. "She's the kind of woman who reminds powerful men how small their pride really is." He gave no reply, but her words stayed with him. Minutes later, an investor approached Jasmine, a warm smile, a glass of champagne in his hand. "So," he laughed softly, "still single?" Jasmine smiled, a genuine smile, calm, comfortable, free of apology. "Yes." One simple word. Another businessman chuckled. "That's impossible. It should have ended there as a harmless conversation, nothing more." Then a voice interrupted. Actually, every conversation stopped. Every head turned. Min-jae stepped forward. "I understand why." Silence settled across the ballroom, heavy, unmoving. "The most successful women," he spoke slowly, "they usually sacrifice family." A pause. "Because they become impossible to love." A few uneasy laughs escaped the crowd. Not because anyone agreed, because no one dared disagree. His eyes remained fixed on Jasmine. "Money builds companies." Another pause. "It doesn't build homes." The words landed harder than he expected, harder than anyone expected. "Still," he continued, and perhaps the faintest smile touched the corner of his mouth, "that's why you're still alone." Silence. Absolute silence. Not a single glass moved. Not a single whisper. 300 people, watching one woman, waiting to see her break. She didn't. Jasmine never lowered her eyes. She never flinched. She never cried. She simply looked at him, calm, steady, unshaken. There was no anger in her expression, only disappointment, the kind that weighs more than rage. She stepped toward him, one step, then another, until only inches separated them. When she spoke, only he could hear, "I hope." A quiet pause. "Your life never depends on someone you made feel this small." Nothing more. She placed her untouched champagne glass on a nearby table, turned, and walked away. No tears, no dramatic exit, no attempt to defend herself. Only dignity, the kind of dignity that becomes unforgettable. Behind her, Min-jae's champagne glass slipped from his hand. It shattered against the marble floor. The sharp crack echoed through the ballroom like a gunshot. For the first time, something inside him shifted. Pride began giving way to regret. No one in that room understood what they had just witnessed. They didn't know that this single moment would become the greatest mistake of Kang Min-jae's life. They didn't know that only 4 days later he would disappear, taken, broken, chained to a steel chair inside an abandoned warehouse far from Seoul's glittering skyline, praying that the woman he had humiliated would be the one to save him. Outside, the night air was cool. Jasmine walked alone. Her heels echoed softly against the pavement. Her heart remained steady. She didn't know, exhaustive, that leaving the ballroom wasn't the end of her story with Kang Min-jae. It was only the beginning of the most important chapter of both their lives. 4 days. That's all it took for everything to change. Kang Min-jae's arm was discovered on a quiet road outside Seoul. Bullet holes covered the vehicle. The metal was twisted, scorched. Emergency lights flashed across the empty highway, painting the wreckage in red and blue. His bodyguards were dead. Min-jae was gone. No witnesses, No ransom demand, no trace of where he had been taken. Within hours, the news spread across Asia. Han Group stock collapsed. Police launched the largest investigation the country had seen in years. Every available resource, every experienced investigator, every possible lead, they found nothing. Days became weeks, and with every passing hour, hope grew thinner. Then, without warning, a package arrived at Han Group headquarters. It was stained with blood, wrapped in silence. Inside was Min Jae's watch, still ticking, and beneath it, a handwritten note, only one sentence. Find the woman he humiliated. She's the only one who can save him. Silence filled the boardroom, heavy, uncomfortable. An elderly director finally spoke, barely above a whisper. Jasmine. Across the room, Min Jae's grandmother stood. Her voice trembled, but her decision did not. Bring her back. Half a world away, Jasmine had found something she hadn't known she needed. Peace. She sat quietly on the porch of her mother's home in Georgia. The afternoon sun warmed her face. The memories of that ballroom had finally begun to fade. She had chosen peace instead of bitterness, the same way she had always chosen determination instead of doubt. Then, her phone rang, an international number. For a brief moment, she considered ignoring it. Something inside her said otherwise. She answered, Miss Cole. The voice was elderly, fragile. It was Min Jae's grandmother. My grandson has been taken. Jasmine became completely still, without warning. The memories returned, the ballroom, the silence, the laughter, his words, the humiliation. There are hundreds of security experts. Her voice remained calm, measured. You don't need me. No. The old woman's voice broke. They're asking for you. Jasmine closed her eyes. She remembered walking away that night, with dignity, with peace, without revenge. Then another memory surfaced. Her father's voice, steady, gentle. Character isn't revealed by how we treat people who respect us. It's revealed by how we treat those who don't deserve our kindness. She opened her eyes. When does my flight leave? When Jasmine returned to Seoul, everything had changed. No whispers, no quiet judgment, no doubtful looks. She wasn't an outsider anymore. She wasn't simply a consultant. She was their last hope. Within hours, she reviewed every file, every report, every photograph, every failed lead. Then she found something no one else had seen. This kidnapping was never about money. It had been planned. Months in advance, every detail carefully engineered. The kidnappers wanted something far more valuable than ransom. Encrypted information, evidence of an international network of corrupt executives, billions stolen through cybercrime. Min Jae had been secretly investigating them. Only he possessed the final encryption key. That was why he was still alive. Jasmine continued working. Satellite images, security footage, encrypted messages, digital fingerprints. Slowly, the pieces came together. Then she smiled, quietly, confidently, the same calm confidence that had built her career. I know where they're hiding him. The investigators stared. One finally asked, how? She pointed toward the map. They wanted us to think like soldiers. A brief pause. They forgot. I'd think like a hacker. Far outside the city, inside an abandoned warehouse, Kang Min-jae remained chained to a steel chair. His face was bruised. His wrists were torn raw. 8 days without freedom. 8 days without surrender. One kidnapper grabbed his collar. Give us the password. Min-jae looked directly into his eyes. Blood stained his lips. His voice was barely above a whisper. No. The punch came instantly. Everything went black. When consciousness finally returned, he could barely lift his head. The warehouse was silent, cold, dark. He whispered, only one name, Jasmine. Not because he expected forgiveness, not because he believed he deserved mercy, but because somewhere inside the darkness, he had finally understood what real strength looked like. It wasn't power, it wasn't wealth, it wasn't pride, hidden beneath expensive suits. It was quiet dignity, the kind carried by the woman he had once tried to humiliate outside. Night settled over the mountains. Jasmine moved silently, with the rescue team beside her, every step carefully planned. She had traced the kidnappers through a hidden digital signal buried inside their fake ransom messages. She had mapped every entrance, every security camera, every blind spot, every escape route. She wasn't there for revenge. She was there to save a life. And somewhere inside that warehouse, the man who had humiliated her in front of 300 people was about to learn exactly what kind of woman she really was. Darkness had completely swallowed the mountains outside Seoul. By the time Jasmine reached the warehouse, the building stood alone, half collapsed, forgotten by the world, except for the men, who believed it was the perfect place to hide their crime. Jasmine moved through the shadows, with quiet precision, the same focus she brought to every line of code, every cyber attack she had stopped, every impossible problem she had ever solved. This wasn't different. It was simply another system waiting to be broken. Only this time, a life depended on getting it right. She raised one hand, the rescue team behind her stopped instantly. Then, they moved, without a word. Flashlights sliced through the darkness. Dust floated silently through the stale air. Rusted machines, broken concrete, long abandoned. Then, in the far corner, she saw him, Kang Min-jae, slumped against a steel chair, his wrists bound tightly, his face bruised almost beyond recognition. Gone was the untouchable billionaire. Gone was the flawless confidence. 8 days of pain, 8 days of silence, 8 days of refusing to surrender the one secret his enemies desperately wanted. He had protected it with the same stubborn determination that had once made him proud. Only now, that determination was protecting innocent lives. The flashlight reached his face. Slowly, he lifted his head. His swollen eyes struggled to focus. Then, he saw her, Jasmine, the woman he had humiliated, the woman whose quiet dignity had followed him into every sleepless night, the woman he never believed would come back for him. She knelt beside him, without hesitation. Her hands remained steady as she loosened the restraints around his wrists. There was no anger, no satisfaction, no revenge, only urgency, and beneath it, compassion for a man who had already been broken far more deeply than anyone else could see. You came. His voice barely existed. Weak, broken, filled with disbelief. Jasmine continued freeing the final restraint. Then she looked into his eyes, calm, steady, the same way she had looked at him inside the ballroom. I told you. A quiet pause. I hoped your life would never depend on someone you humiliated. She gently removed the final restraint. I meant it as a warning, not a threat. Before another word could be spoken, gunfire shattered the silence. The rescue team engaged the kidnappers. The warehouse erupted into chaos. Without hesitation, Jasmine pulled Min-jae behind a concrete pillar, shielding him, protecting him. Her focus never wavered. Minutes later, the gunfire stopped. Silence returned. Heavy, filled only with dust. And Min-jae's uneven breathing, she helped him stand. His tattooed arm rested heavily across her shoulders. Together, step by step, they walked toward the exit, toward fresh air, toward flashing emergency lights. It felt strangely familiar. Months earlier, she had walked away from him, inside a ballroom. Now, she was walking beside him, toward safety. At the hospital, the doors opened. His grandmother rushed forward. Tears streamed freely down her face. She embraced Jasmine. No words were needed. Gratitude needed no translation. Han Group executives stood nearby, the same people who had once whispered about her. Now they stood in silence, humbled, watching the woman who had saved everything they valued most. Several days later, the hospital room was quiet. The machines barely whispered. Most of the bruises had begun to heal. Min-jae sat against the pillows, changed. The pride that had once surrounded him was gone. I said things. His voice was soft. I can never take back. There was no arrogance left, only honesty. Jasmine smiled gently, saying, not because she had forgotten, but because she understood. You're alive. A small pause. That's what matters right now. It wasn't forgiveness, not completely. It wasn't forgetting, but it was a beginning built, not on power, not on money, not on pride, but on truth, on humility, on respect. Weeks passed. Han Group changed. The headquarters no longer greeted Jasmine with whispers. She no longer walked alone. She walked beside Min-jae as an equal. Every conversation carried quiet respect. Every glance spoke more than words ever could. One evening, as the sun disappeared behind Seoul's skyline, they stood together on a quiet rooftop. Golden light covered the city. Min-jae slowly reached for her hand, not as the powerful vice chairman, not as a billionaire, simply as a man who had finally learned what real character looked like, a man humbled enough to recognize it. Jasmine looked at him. Then she didn't pull away, because sometimes the people who witness our worst moments also witness our greatest transformation. Sometimes quiet dignity becomes the strongest force in any room. whether it's a boardroom, a ballroom, or an abandoned warehouse. Jasmine arrived in Seoul as a stranger. She left as the woman whose grace changed the ending of a story that could have ended in tragedy. Instead, it gave one man a reason to become someone worth saving.